This video goes over the mini lesson for Bend 1, Session 5 of Writing Realistic Fiction. Today's focus is plotting your narrative using different tools. It's important to remember that writers sketch out possible plot lines for stories using things like story arcs, timelines, lists, or mentor text to help that their stories follow a traditional story structure. And I want to call attention to the fact that it says possible plot lines. I know a lot of you have a set story in your mind, but I want you to go into this work time with an open mind and try out different plots to see if there's a better story out there for you. And here we talked about story structure, and that a lot of you are used to the plot diagram or Freytag experiment, whatever you've called it in the past. And we're going to come back to that structure in a moment. But first, just a reminder that for this assignment, it's better to have 2 or 3 really well-written scenes than a whole clutter of scenes that you rush through to finish and you end up summarizing most of your story instead of storytelling. So as you're plotting today, just remember that we are working with a seed story. We talked about how most of us are really used to seeing the plot diagram as our story shape. We start off pretty flat with the exposition. The rising action starts to rise up, and we're introduced to the obstacles and the conflict in the story, and that builds tension. And then finally, when we get to the climax, the tension stops, the character changes, there's a turning point, and then we have the falling action, which leads to the resolution. Today I want to introduce a couple different story shapes that I think will be more helpful and a little more sophisticated. What we see a lot of times in 7th grade is with the plot diagram, you just think of beginning, middle, end, and a lot of times the climax of the story actually happens closer to the end of the story. So we're going to move away from using the plot diagram and move into some things that are more sophisticated. So as you're writing, I want you to think about what shape of a story are you writing. I think a lot of you are writing this common story shape called man in a hole or person in a hole. And what happens with this is that the character starts off okay up here in good fortune. If we're thinking about this line here, this is the beginning. This is the end of the story. Anything up here is good fortune. Anything down here is bad fortune. So oftentimes in the beginning of the story, the character is in good fortune. Things are okay. But then they get into trouble and they start to drop into this bad fortune, and they're coming up against obstacles and they're trying to work their way through it. They hit the lowest point, and then things start to change, and that brings them back into good fortune, and they usually end up better than they started off, which is really encouraging for readers when they read a story about a character who overcomes a major obstacle and is better off for it. And this, I think, is what a lot of you are writing, and like this point right here would be that turning point that we talk about as the climax. It's an event that changes the story and changes the shape of the story. Another common story shape is the Cinderella story, right? Cinderella starts off pretty low. She has an evil stepmother. She's basically a slave, but then things start to get better for her, right? She gets the invitation to the ball. A fairy godmother comes. She gets a pretty dress. She goes to the ball. She meets the prince, but then it turns 12 o'clock. She has to run away. She loses her shoe, and she ends up in even a worse spot than when she started after this point. And it's not until the prince finds her the shoe that things start to get better, and she ends up with good fortune infinitely because of the happily ever after of this kind of story. So I think a lot of you are using man in a hole, and we can use a story arc to plan. And so what the story arc does is it doesn't really necessarily focus on beginning, middle, end like the plot diagram. It helps us figure out that something's going to happen, things are going to get tough, the tension's going to build, but then there's an event that happens that changes the shape of the story, of the arc, and that changes the problem and the character, and at the end, things are different, the character is different. And in class, we together practiced creating a story arc for Ribbons. And so we said the first event in the arc was Stacy's grandmother comes to live with them, and then a couple events that build the tension and get in the way of Stacy's motivation were the fact that the grandmother favors her little brother, Stacy's little brother, and that Stacy's shoes get taken away. And so those two major plot events really build the tension. And it's not until when Stacy realizes that there was a miscommunication, a misunderstanding about what those ballet shoes were, that the story starts to change. And then it changes the shape of the arc, and Stacy's able to resolve things with her grandmother, and they end up with a better relationship. And what we learn from this is that the story arc, even though we only use the major events in the arc, we can clearly see, okay, Stacy's wants at the beginning were to dance ballet and to have a relationship with her grandmother. And the events that we listed on that story arc directly relate to those. Those are the obstacles. And in the end of the arc, Stacy's able to resolve both of those and get what she wants. She gets her shoes back, and she has a relationship with her grandmother. So that's really important to remember as you design your own story arc. Consider what the character wants. The obstacles are going to build that tension, and then something has to happen that allows the character to get what they want. To start, we came up with first scenes for my story about Danielle. So I said the opening scenario, the starting scenario I wanted was Stacy getting on the bus the morning after being told her parents are getting a divorce. And your classmates brainstormed different first scenes for that. And they came up with all different ideas. And it was really fascinating because we had the same scenario, but all the scenes looked different. And we talked about how we could take each one of those first scenes and build a story arc off of them, and the story arcs would look different. And this is where I want you to go into drafting with an open mind. Different starting points, different turning points are going to make your arc look different, and that you should be trying to create more than one arc and then choosing which one you think works best. In class, you began planning the narrative using multiple story arcs to find a different story that might be surprising and might be better than what you originally had in mind. Then moving on to other planning tools like timelines, flowcharts, storyboards to fill in those smaller events that weren't captured on the story arc. Your mentor texts, ribbons, two kinds. The Treasure of Lemon Brown are great inspiration if you're struggling with how do I start this story, or how do I only get this into a seed story. Looking back at those will be really helpful to you. To wrap up, we talked about the homework, which is going to be a one-sentence summary on a question in Google Classroom using the frame somebody wanted but so then. And then we also took a look at the grade 6, grade 7 narrative rubric and just looked at our own writing that we have done over the past 5 days and thought about, okay, what am I doing? What do I need to keep doing? What do I need to improve on? And just jotting down some notes and goals in the writer's notebook. So that was session 5 of Bend 1, which is the final session in Bend 1. We'll be starting Bend 2, where we get into more drafting soon.